So good morning, everybody. Welcome to OPM. I'm delighted that we've got an extraordinarily distinguished panel, including Lant in Delhi, and an extraordinarily distinguished audience here in the room. And I'm hoping the technology has allowed our international offices to join us as well. So you're all very welcome. My name is Mark Henstridge. I'm OPM's chief economist. There's one point of housekeeping, which is a safety point. We don't expect a fire alarm. If the alarms go off, we have to assume it's for real. Essentially, those of you who are visitors, please follow those of us who are not. We have exits at the front, exits at the back, and an exit at the side, but we can take you to the place of safety. So we have an extraordinarily distinguished panel. Thank you all for coming. Kunal Sen is director of the UNU WIDER. He's professor of development economics in the Global Development Institute at the University of Manchester and has been joint research director of ESID, the Effective States and Inclusive Development Programme. François Bourguignon is emeritus professor at the Paris School of Economics, former chief economist at the World Bank, and indeed was previously director at the Paris School of Economics. Lant Pritchett, joining from Delhi, professor at the Blavatnik School of Government, previously professor of the practice of development at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. Sue Parnell, Global Challenges Professor at the University of Bristol, Emeritus Professor at the University of Cape Town, and the co-founder of the African Centre for Cities. Stefan Dercon, Professor of Economic Policy at the Blavatnik School of Government, Director of the Centre for the Study of African Economies here at Oxford, and former Chief Economist at DFID. And Stevan Lee will be joining the panel, Principal Economist in my team here at OPM, and the lead author on our working paper on Thicker Diagnostics. Thicker Diagnostics means diagnostics that go beyond the original focus on growth and the economics of growth that was in the original growth diagnostic. It opens up thinking about diagnostics to an awful lot of additional questions and challenges. So we therefore, in this panel with an array of distinguished speakers, have quite a tight format. So some of the indication on timekeeping is going to be provided to you from Kat, please notice. The format will be 2 blocks of 3 speakers each. So we will kick off with Kunal, followed by François and Lant from Delhi. And some of the questions that we've asked them to address as part of their remarks will include what is a diagnostic and what does it mean when the political considerations and the social considerations are mixed in with the economic. In particular, if institutions and policy are somehow endogenized, what does that do to the idea of coming through to a diagnostic of a policy problem? And what do we think these things are for, and to whom are they addressed? So after the first block of 3, we'll have a panel discussion. We'll move then to a second block, Sue, Stefan, and Stevan. And at this point, we move into the sort of how do we do these things a bit. So how does a more interdisciplinary, thicker approach to a diagnostic actually work? How can the economics, which everybody would reasonably agree is key to thinking about development, blend in with the politics or the social factors, which most reasonable people would agree can't really be left out if you're trying to think deeply? What can a diagnostic framework help with if it's trying to say something about the use of evidence from one setting and applying it to another? And we'll try and walk through our effort at an example of doing this with Steven's contribution. We then have more panel discussion and open the floor to Q&A. So there's a fairly tight format. There's a lot to be getting on with. I will therefore ask Kunal to kick us off. Thank you.
So thanks, Mark. It's really a great privilege to be here, partly because being back in OPM and speaking here, but also actually because I'm going to talk about things which I've been thinking about for some time, some with Lant actually, but which are essentially to do with the question of how do we bring in political economy and politics into growth diagnostics. So let me just start off by sort of going back a little bit on already the first issue, the first principles question. What exactly are diagnostics? And one shouldn't really forget that diagnostics came from a particular approach which was really to try and be a response to the Washington consensus. It was this kind of approach that came from Hausman, Roderick and Velasco that said that the anything goes nihilism, the Washington consensus is not very useful when you try to understand growth strategies and growth and economic development itself. And so it was a way of thinking about a framework which would analyze and formulate growth strategies which was both operational, but it was based on sound economic reasoning. And that's important, both operational and sound economic reasoning. And that's something we need to think about. And because it was about local specificities, country context, it was always going to be the economics of the second best. Because once you move away from this universal or blueprint for strategies or reforms, you're looking at country context, it will always be the second best option that you're looking at. That was what it really was about. But I do think that over time, we have deviated from what the original intention was. And we can see it in all the kind of work we see in consultancies, many different policy, in many different development agencies, so on, where I kind of feel that we're missing the wood for the diagnostic tree. What do I mean by that? So again, remember, what were the principles? Pragmatism in the lee of best practice rules of thumb. That was very important. Second, selectivity instead of a laundry list. That was very important. A heuristic approach, not a sausage machine. What has happened, in my view, is that we have often thought of a sausage machine, the tree, thrown stuff into that, cranked it, and hoped that you get something out of that will tell us exactly what are the kind of the constraints that might come out of it. We've seen so many applications of the diagnostic tree, which in my view has actually moved us away from the original intention, which is a kind of way to think about the world, the country looking at in a heuristic way. And that's really been unfortunate. And in my view, it's worth thinking a little bit about that. Okay, moving on to politics. Bringing the politics, why and how. The why is fairly obvious. It was always there in the original HRB approach. Once you're the logic of the second best, the diagnostic approach will reveal more than one binding constraint. It's kind of difficult to imagine that there's only one constraint that is constraining growth in a particular country. There'll always be more than one. It's usually the case that you have to think about it. And of course, the one constraint you think is important for policy reform will be informed of the political complications of undertaking the reform. You have a set of 3 or 4 problems that you see in front of you. You got to think about which is the one seems to be the most possible to do given the political economic constraints. So that was always the case. Having said that, I think it's still not so obvious how do you bring politics into a growth diagnostic. Not very obvious to me. First, there are two approaches. The first approach is, okay, let's think about a causal theory. Let's think about a predictive approach which we can then take to the data, to the country context, and we can hopefully use this to identify the political economy factors that can ignite growth. So it's very much a hypothesis testing approach that we often see in economics. And of course, there are lots of theories out there. Archibald Robinson, North Vallis Weingast, Musa Khan, and even work that I've been doing at Lant and Eric Worker, all of that's there. But all of these theories, in my view, and I don't want to get into it right now, we can talk about it in the Q&A, do not meet internal validity or validity tests for growth diagnostics. They do not simply meet the criteria of having a predictive theory. They're not really not at the level that we can use them for a predictive theory. What do I mean by that? You cannot say that if you see political settlement X in a given country Y, then if you do institutional reform Z, this will lead to growth. You just cannot say that. And even the appropriate scope condition that you might bring in, initial conditions, resource endowments, whatever it is, you simply cannot say that. You cannot make causal statements where we are with the theory of the political economy of growth. And that's, I think, been a huge problem because often there is a tendency to overreach with the political economy story when it comes to growth diagnostics. So what can we really do? We have to go back again to what I said earlier, the way it was thought about in the very first instance itself. You have to use a heuristic approach. You have to go to a direction of thick description and less ambitious in theory development. You've got to understand that we are not at the level of theory development. Or even if we are, we need to make a lot of progress there before we get to a causal theory of the political economic growth. So we've got to go back to thick description. We've got to ask the question that what is politically feasible to undertake given the prevailing political settlement in the country in question. So what do we know of the balance of power between different elites? What do you know about the interests of economic elites and political elites? What are the ideology? Once we know that, we can then use that to think about what is actually possible to do in the country given what we can identify with the growth diagnostic approach. So that's something that tells us that the way to think about that is to think about boundary conditions. Set the boundary. What's really possible in the political space? Rule out the things that you think cannot be done given the political settlement that you see in front of you. And the diagnostic work is to exactly identify the political settlement. What exactly is the political settlement you see in front of you? And that needs diagnostic work. There is simply no template out there that you can use to say, this is the political settlement I see in this country. So here's what you've got to do. You've got to essentially go for second-best politics, to go with second-best economics. And I think we need to go back again to the lessons that we learned from the HRD approach at the very beginning. We are living in a world of second-best economics. We are living in a world of heuristic approaches, which is essentially what the intention was. And if it comes to politics, we also have to go back to the second-best politics world. We cannot expect to see the kind of the way often we think in economics to essentially use political economy as a way to make causal statements about growth diagnostics. So that's my intervention.
Thank
Thanks.
you very much. Thank you, Kunal. François,
should I stand?
whatever you would like to do.
I prefer. Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. And I'm happy to talk after Kumar because he said a lot of things which I was about to say to start with. Okay, I will be talking about diagnostics from my from a personal point of view, in the sense that I am involved in this research project called EDI for economic development and institutions. And within that very big project, which is managed by OPM and in association with the University of Namur and the Paris School of Economics and ADE in Belgium, within this project there is one research activity called institutional diagnostic. And the idea, as it was expressed by DFID, which is funding this research program, the idea was, is it possible to build something equivalent to the gross diagnostic by Hausmann, Roderick, and Velasco in the field of institution? And I believe that it is an extremely difficult exercise. Probably I didn't realize at the beginning how difficult it was. And I'm not sure that at the end there will be really the same kind of approach that we have with the gross diagnostics. The picture that Kunal just showed on the screen, I don't think that we'll ever be able to find something of this type in the field of institutions, basically because we don't have any model. We have some models, as it was mentioned. We have the Acemoglu-Robinson, we have the political settlement, we have these models, but these models are to some extent too general to get to recommendations in terms of specific reforms, in terms of a true diagnostic, saying, okay, if you want to identify the obstacles coming from institutions to development, this is the way you have to go. You have to first look at this, then look at that, and make that kind of test, invent shadow prices, and at the end you'll get something telling you if you reform the civil service in that way, then you'll have gotten rid of one of the most important obstacles to development. We don't have that. What the models, and this is something I would like to add on what Kunal said, the models are nice models, but at the same time these are equilibrium models. And if, for example, we have in mind the Acemoglu-Robinson model and the political settlement model, those models are equilibrium in the sense that they are completely integrated. They are combining the economics and the political decision process. And they say there is multiple equilibria, and you may be stuck in an equilibrium which is completely consistent, where the politics will be functioning in that way, the economics will be functioning that way, and the economy will grow maybe at a very, very slow rate because this is not the right equilibrium. And the big issue is, how do we move from one equilibrium to another equilibrium? So it's like you have a circle, and you understand the way in which things are moving along the circle. And this is fine, and this is already a big progress. But the problem is that we don't know how to cut the circle, how to get in and try to move some of those particles moving along the circles in another circle. So because of that, I believe that it is not possible to avoid being rather pragmatic. And in the case of EDI, if I can explain quickly what we are trying to do, the way in which we decided to proceed is the following. Because we don't have a model to start with, we decided to do case studies. And we decided to pick up a couple of countries in the targets of DFID, which are essentially low-income countries or lower middle-income countries, and to do an in-depth study in those countries of institutions. And by the way, institutions is not very, very clearly defined, and this is another difficulty of that exercise. And maybe Lant will not agree with me, but from time to time I dream that I would be trying to do a diagnostic on something a little more precise than institutions. Okay? But so basically you are trying to see the way in which different types of institutions are working, and the way in which they may be responsible or not responsible for some kind of binding constraints on economic growth or economic development in general. And once we will have done those case studies, then the idea is really to sit down with the author of those case studies and to say, okay, what did we learn about the relationship between obstacles to development, institutions, and of course, possible reforms, possible the causes of the institutional weaknesses, and beyond the causes, what is the kind of remedies, what kind of reform should be undertaken, and something that Kunal had just mentioned, the way in which those reforms could be implemented politically. Okay, so this is the whole sequence of questions that we are asking. And out of the case studies, at least we'll have in the first stage 4 case studies. Out of those 4 case studies, the issue will be: did we learn anything about how to identify weaknesses, how to identify the remedies to those weaknesses, and how to analyze the political feasibility of implementing reforms? The 4 countries are Tanzania, which is now completed, and you can find it on the OPM website. The second one is Benin, which is just been finished. The third one, which should be finished in a few months, is Bangladesh. And the fourth one, which is still underway, is Mozambique. And out of those 4 countries, we hope that we'll find some framework which could be used to establish a diagnostic of institutions and development. And then we'll try to test that framework by going to a 5th country together, I mean all the authors of those 4 case studies, and trying to see whether they are effective in analyzing, in establishing a diagnostic of this 5th country in a lapse of time which will be reduced in comparison with the time that we spent on the first 4 studies. So this is the way we go. Now let me say something about what are the ingredients of those case studies, and something about the result of the conclusions, at least in the case of Tanzania and Benin. I mean the nature of the conclusion. The ingredients are we decided to use all what was possible, all the kind of information that was possible in any country. So we, of course, read carefully the gross diagnostics kind of study which were available. We did our own analysis of the political history, economic history, economic development today. Then we interviewed key informants, presidents, past presidents certainly, or ministers and people, key people in politics, etc. We made a survey among not the population, but people who are supposed to know something about the way in which the economy and the society and politics do work in a country. We used all the databases with institutional indicators, and there is one database which is a kind of repository of all the other databases, which is quite impressive, with thousands of variables, and we tried to figure out something, how to use that kind of information. And finally, we decided to analyze in more depth some critical areas that would be revealed by all that first information, first exploitation of the information that I just mentioned. And then we identified 4 or 5 critical areas, and we decided to understand the way in which this was working. For example, I'll give you an example, and this is probably the best, the example I prefer in all what we have done until now. It is the example of the power sector in Tanzania. Basically, what is the way in which this sector is being regulated. And by analyzing the evolution, the way in which this is working, then you understand a lot of things about why it is the case that Tanzania is, it is a little less the case today than it was when we started the study, but Tanzania is among the African countries with the least power per inhabitant. And you understand why, because it is true that you have a paradox, which is absolutely fantastic, which is that there is a regulation authority in Tanzania for the power sector. We went to see them, and when I went out of the meeting with them, I told myself, but we have nothing to teach and to tell and to bring to those people. They are excellent, and as a matter of fact, most of them had a PhD from Toulouse. They were all good specialists of regulation, and fine, it's okay. If this sector is in the hands of those people, probably it is not possible to do better than what they do. But then, a week later, we learned that the head of this regulatory agency has simply been fired, because the president decided that the recommendation that the regulatory authority made on the price of electricity was not satisfactory. It was too high, the increase was too high, and because he wanted to favor and to help poor people in Tanzania, then this was not acceptable. So he imposed the price of electricity, and he fired people in the agency because they were in disagreement with him. There is very much to be learned from this, in the sense that in terms of institutions, the regulation authority is something which is absolutely essential in any society. And in terms of institution, you want to understand the way in which that regulation authority, the way in which members of that authority are being you are from time to time. Sorry, I didn't see the sign. Yes, you have to know something about the way in which members of the board are being appointed. Whether, in the case of Tanzania, it turns out that they are all directly appointed by the president. So, of course, you cannot have. So, this is an interesting conclusion, weakness that we identify in the system. Then you understand that if there is a regulation authority, then the president doesn't have any reason to go against its recommendations. And finally, by doing that, by doing this kind of, having this kind of practice, which is that the president suddenly decides that the price of electricity will be modified in this or this other way. This is a clear disincentive for any private investor to come in and to make a contract with the agency and to say, we will be with a company distributing electricity, saying we will be selling you electricity at that price, and you'll be distributing that electricity to the users. Private investors want to have some insurance on what will be the price that they will be paid. Now, if it is the case that the president of anybody else can decide about the price that will be charged to the users, then the private investor will say, okay, there is too much uncertainty here. To some extent, this is a kind of weakness of property rights on this, because you are simply reducing the or reneging possibly on the contract made by between the country and the private investor. And because of that, private investors don't want to get into this kind of deal. And there have been various experiences in Tanzania with private investors. Moreover, a lot of corruption corresponding to the way in which the private investor, the private company was elected, of course. So in a very restricted area, which is power and electricity production and distribution, you have, in the case of Tanzania, a very nice view about the way institutions work, or how badly some institutions are working, etc. And what was really quite fascinating was the fact that in the world, among the people who know about the regulation of electricity distribution, Tanzania was cited as being the best kind of regulatory authority that you could find. So we have done that for, I will not go over the other chapters, but sorry, you don't have to tell me that I have to stop. But we do that for others, other areas, land rights and civil service, etc. And then at the end of that, we say, okay, what did we learn out of this? Are there weaknesses, institutional weaknesses, which are common to all these areas, specific to these areas? Can we list them? And we interpret this list as the symptoms of institutional weaknesses. And with an analogy with medical diagnostics, we have the symptoms, then we have to try to figure out what are the causes for those symptoms. And then we have some reflection on this. And based on that reflection, we say, okay, this is the kind of reforms that could be undertaken if we were to if we wanted to remedy those weaknesses that were identified. And there is a list of reforms, etc. But then I come to the last part. And what I've said about Tanzania, of course, would apply to Benin, would apply to Bangladesh, etc. This is simply to tell you about the way in which we look at those things. But let me conclude with the final result of all this. Now we have a set of reforms. We say, for example, in the case of electricity, please change the constitution and the way in which the board of the regulatory agency is being appointed. Okay, make sure that the opposition is there and that the users are appointing people, etc. Okay, fine. This is certainly something which is being recommended. Now, when we think about whether this has any chance to be accepted, and this is where I'm getting back to what Kunal had said before, when we get into the politics, then it is a completely different story. I mean, why would it be the case that the president would simply give up the possibility of controlling completely that entity that is running the power sector? And if we want that, we should get into the political settlement and the possibility, okay, but who is the opposition? Who are the people who could be interested in that reform? and would be able to put pressure on the president or the running party for this reform to take place. But then we are getting into a completely different game, because now we have to get into the politics, the local politics, and we have to understand who are the various factions within the dominant party in one side or the other side, how the opposition actually works or doesn't work. And this is something which is a different kind of exercise, in the sense that I don't think it is possible to get into realistic prediction about this reform could be passed if those people were serious in trying to have it passed. And this is really where maybe this is the weakness of the study, but this is where we stop. So okay, no, because any time, and in the case of Benin, it was becoming more serious, because some of our people received some threats, telling they were told, don't try to understand too well what is going on in the cotton sector. This may be dangerous. Okay, so what do you do under these conditions? So this is really the disappointment at the end, because we have a list, I think, which is quite reasonable, and the diagnostic works from that point of view. But the diagnostic is not working in terms of trying to implement the reforms that are there. Or it works in a completely trivial way. Maybe we could say, okay, get rid of this guy over there, and things would be much better. But of course, this is not something that we could recommend. And some people really, I remember the Gross Commission that was put together under Michael Spence several years ago, when one of their conclusions was leadership is really the main issue in the development. Okay, fine, but as long as it is not possible to decide about who will be the leader, it is not really something which is satisfactory. So at the same time, I believe that the exercise that we are doing is worthwhile. We are doing a diagnostic. Now, the use that can be made of the diagnostic is something which is somewhat different. Okay, let me stop here. Sorry to have been too long, and thank you very much.
So we now are looking forward to having Lant come in from Delhi.
Hi, Rishi, can you use your camera?
The Tanzanian case is very
There he is.
interesting. The Tanzanian case is very interesting.
Hey Lant, we can see you. I hope you can hear us, and I hope we can hear you. Might need to unmute.
I think is your mic on mute?
Mute.
There you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Great. So they just knocked your camera, so I'm seeing your very nicely polished shoes.
I try and look after them for you.
So I'm really glad to be here today. This is really, I think, a super exciting initiative. This is one of the most exciting things I've seen in development economics in a while, because it's taking serious that the national development agenda is really as important as the project implementation agenda, and that development is more than just a series of individual unconnected interventions. It's actually a dynamic process of social, political, administrative, and economic transformation, and we need to have better models. And second, it's taking seriously that there's been a lot of academic work about what in fact drives that, and is asking the very hard question, how do we take these quite abstract theories, which kind of seem to agree and disagree among themselves, and start from opposite ends of the causal spectrum, and kind of reconcile that into what would a practical organization working with a practical government do. And so I want to speak to the two questions that are posed on my slide of what are diagnostics for, and who are they for? And I think I was part of the development of the Hausman-Roderick Velasco diagnostic, and we had some very clear reasons why we developed this diagnostic. The first is to not get it wrong. You can build kind of a default economic model and then assume everything is some minor variant of that might be stronger or weaker. But if you have the wrong model, you could actually get the signs wrong. I was working in Indonesia during the financial crisis of 1998, and the IMF came in, and they had a working model that the government needed to signal it was tough and undertake tough reforms. So they, as part of their first letter of intent, closed 16 banks, one of which was owned by the President Suharto, on the theory that that would signal to international investors that the government was willing to do tough things, which would bring international money back in, which would solve the outflow of capital. It had precisely the opposite effect, because Indonesia was a deals world, and the only thing protecting the Chinese entrepreneurs, who controlled enormous parts of the formal economy, was the word of Suharto. And they all said, if Suharto is so weak, he'll give up his own son's bank. Who's next? We are. And we have no legal protection. We have no social protection, because precisely Suharto had used the Chinese because he knew they had no political roots and hence would be beholden to him. Every loose rupiah fled the country. Every loose dollar fled the country, and the exchange rate went from 5 when the IMF letter intent to 12 in like a month. So they just had the wrong diagnostic, and it wasn't kind of like, how tough of signal of credibility should we send? They just had the wrong model of what was going to build credibility to who and what was relevant. So the first point of a diagnostic is to not get it wrong. And everybody is using a diagnostic, but at once we had somebody who said that everyone's a theoretician. It's just that the people who think they are terrible theoreticians, because they think they're not operating in a theoretical model, and they don't write it down, and they don't force it to be discussed and debated. It's just implicit. But nearly everyone who operates off an implicit theory has a terrible theory, and nearly whenever operating on an implicit diagnostic has a terrible diagnostic, because you aren't forced to articulate your thing. The second point of a diagnostic is prioritization. Our kind of model is that there's a trinity. In order to be effective, it actually has to be causally right. If you do it, it should achieve the outcome you intended. Second, you have to be able to do it administratively in the context you're in. And third, you have to generate and sustain the political coalition to do it. And our, goal of the diagnostic was to not burn up political and administrative capability, which is always scarce, on things that weren't important. So it was a prioritization tool. When I teach the diagnostic, I often start with my classes of students who want to do development, and I say, what's good for economic growth? And in 10 minutes, they can list 30 things. And so then I say, suppose you're the president of the country. What do? Do you do these 30 things? Do you need to do all of them? Do you need to do some of them? You can only do 3. So all of these are good for growth in the sense that they have a positive derivative. Long run income would be higher if you did them. But the question of a diagnostic is, and this is why it's literally the metaphor of a binding constraint. What is that constraint that, if we were able to do it politically, administratively, would in fact have big impacts, not small impacts? Because if you prioritize the other way and say what's politically expedient and let's do that, you may end up doing a bunch of things that are easy to do, and good for growth in some long run, vague, positive derivative sense, but aren't in fact in that context binding constraints, and hence are really not going to change the underlying growth dynamic. And then the third thing is to avoid solution-driven approaches. Solution-driven is a dominant mode of the aid and donor and management consultant industry. And so they have a solution and they want to sell it to the government. And what the diagnostic helps you at least do is say that's not actually a solution to a problem that's a key constraint for us. So yeah, we could do civil service reform, but we just don't see the connection. We don't start with a problem and end up at civil service reform. So if you start from civil service reform as the solution, the odds that that happens to be the thing that alleviates a binding constraint are slim to none, because you haven't done the diagnostic. So I think those are three things that we deliberately started downstream of. Let's not get it wrong, so let's not misunderstand the nature of the economy so that we do something that makes it worse. Let's get prioritization, because the typical donor strategy lists, I was working in South Sudan, for heaven's sake, and United Nations wrote a development plan for South Sudan on its immediate independence that had, I kid you not, 133 goals in the health sector. And the government of South Sudan couldn't do anything. It wasn't anything. It didn't even exist yet. And each of those goals was super ambitious relative to their capability. So they were just, the prioritization is super important and the solution driven. Now, the second thing is, I think there was a suggestion in what I should discuss is, do you really need to do a political and institutional diagnostic? Because after all, the people in the country know how it works. Is this just something for the outsiders to do so that they understand it? And there's a motivational poster in this room, which I like, because it just has one word on it: disagree. I don't know how that's a motivational poster in a company, but okay, I'm all in favor of it. So first, I think part of the important work that we've been doing recently with Kunal and other authors is on deals environments versus rules environment, and that fundamentally in a weak institutional or weak organizational capability for implementation environment, the formal reality and what the government says it's doing and what actually happens diverge almost completely. And in a very real sense, the administrative facts that are generated and formally treated are a total fiction. And I do think even for people living and working, it's easy to get confused, and the reality is invisible. I mean, to some extent, political settlements around allocation of rents often work by being invisible. And so it is not obvious to me that people in an economy really know how it works, and in part because the purpose often of institutions is to project a myth that isn't fundamentally true, but which nevertheless organizes action. So I do not at all agree that one doesn't need to do a political institutional diagnostic because people already know how it works. I don't think that's true. And then second, I think doing the political institutional diagnostic has a second purpose, which is in order to take action, you need agreement among the actors on kind of what the default state of play is. And I think a lot of what happens is even within the government or even within the civil society and private sector actors, there's not a shared view of what the constraint is. And hence, you're assuming there's a consensus on the diagnostic that doesn't exist and that you can move, therefore, to action. And without the diagnostic that surfaces what people actually think the political and institutional environment constraints are, I don't think you're going to be able to generate the agreement you need to adopt and implement anyway. And so I think it's a necessary first step. There's the world exists in a lot of ambiguity, and people often call this constructive ambiguity, but it's often just you say one thing and I'll say another and we'll pretend we mean the same thing in order to not be effective at anything. So it's often passive-aggressive ambiguity, not constructive ambiguity. And the last reason I think you need to do a political and institutional diagnostic is to push from forms to functions. in the sense that one of the lessons I think that emerges from the work, again, that Kunal and I have been doing is countries have not initiated growth episodes by getting to good institutions. It's just completely, totally false. Nearly all the episodes of significant rapid growth have begun and persisted for many years with weak institutions. So while OECD has good institutions and high income, that doesn't necessarily dictate that there's some linear dynamics. And I think, a lot of the institutional work is more about the dynamics and more about how do you accomplish the functions for which institutions exist. So if you say we need secure property rights, that's a functional description. If you say we need land titles of a certain type, giving fee simple ownership to land, that is a way in which some societies have conveyed security of property rights. But there might be other ways of securing property rights that accomplish the same objective. And unless one does an institutional diagnostic, one is going to end up with isomorphism of institutions and recommending civil service reform on the premise that if you manage to achieve the forms, you'll achieve the function, as opposed to starting from the diagnostic need for the function to accomplish the goal, and then a creative discussion about how in this context do we start and achieve that function. So I think that's three reasons of why you would do a diagnostic and what a diagnostic is for. It's to not get it wrong. It's to prioritize so you don't waste your time and fritter away scarce political and administrative capital on things that look good on paper and are good for growth in the long run but aren't binding constraints, and to avoid the solution-driven isomorphism that absorbs 80 to 90% of the bullshit that comes out of the multilateral institutions. Then if you say, who is it for? I think it's for the actors on the ground themselves, because I think it's a myth that they actually have necessarily a surfaced, articulated, correct understanding, because precisely in a deals environment, invisibility is key. And if you're not willing to make it visible, you can't effectively act on it. And then I think it also can generate agreement about what the functional purpose of the reforms are that allows you to be more creative about the ways in which we accomplish those functional purposes. So there's a very good book of how China escaped the poverty trap, where Yun Ang gives the example of a city in China that wanted to increase foreign investment. There's a standard kind of set of reforms about increasing foreign investment that involves setting up a foreign investment agency and, marketing your city and blah, blah, blah. What they did is they told every employee of the city of government that part of their job description was generating foreign investment. Bus drivers, teachers, policemen, every city employee said part of your job is what our city needs is more foreign investment. Part of your job is to generate more foreign investment. Absolutely insane, right? This is like the stupidest possible thing you can imagine. It worked like gangbusters, because they said, oh, by the way, I have a cousin who has a connection, and they called him up and said, hey, I'd look good in my job as a policeman if I could attract some foreign investment, and some people, and it worked. And then after that started working, and after they started getting more in foreign investment, then they could create structures that kept it going. So again, I think flexibility and creativity only comes if you have a functional, a prioritized problem and a description of what you need to accomplish, rather than starting from a presumption, the actual instantiation of the institutions that would accomplish that function, which is the isomorphism that, again, deadens creativity and leads to ineffectiveness. So that's everything I have to say.
Okay, thank you, Lant. Thank you. So let's move it to the panel, and I want to bring in Stefan and Sue for any immediate reactions, given that you've been listening rather than doing any of the speaking so far. One of the things that occurs to me in trying to pull together what is a very rich combination of contributions is that the fundamental point that Kunal started off with, that there are models, and François echoed this, but they're equilibrium models, and so you have to be more pragmatic, is to then ask, well, what is it that you can bring to the thinking and the structure, because as Lant says, you have to be a little bit overt and not implicit about theorizing or models that provides for dynamics. So the North Wallis-Weingast economic history thinking provides some identification of threshold characteristics that shifts from one state to another. Is that helpful? Do you have any reflections on those things?
Sure. I'm going to try and be quite provocative in my response rather than to endorse, because I think there's quite a lot, and you saw the commonality coming out on some major sorts of things. But very specifically on that, I think the one thing which we haven't surfaced are the issues of time and of locational fixity. Because some of what happens over time is that traditions are evolve. Not just institutional traditions, but personal and professional traditions, which get embedded and are extremely difficult to identify and displace or use. And they make prioritization very difficult. And it's a very different form of politics to the ones that I think are being alluded to be brought in. Okay, they're the silent politics. They don't even have a little p. Okay, so that's the first thing. And then the second thing is that I have to say I'm a geographer. And what that always draws me to is the question of fixity. Lots of what we're talking about results in really material things. Things happen and they get locked in place. And so you land up with investments or you land up with locational dynamics which are absolutely fundamental to what becomes possible. So those would be the two things that I would put in there, are questions of time and space.
Thank you. Steph, anything?
Well, just a minimal thing, and actually following up from Lant's final example on this Chinese city, I think what we sometimes forget in doing some of the growth diagnostics, you start looking for these kind of objective constraints, you know. In fact, even yesterday I was talking with someone who actually is one of the three original growth diagnostic people who was doing a diagnostic on a country he didn't know anything about, and going to some very material, very specific thing, where I think what Lant brought out very well is there are a lot of things to do with policy making and decision making. A lot has to do often with shared expectations amongst the key people.
The tradition.
Yeah, and it's actually, and we know very well also from economics thinking about it, that there could be multiple equilibria in these sets of shared beliefs. And, with your example of what's happening with Mr. Magufuli in Tanzania is actually a fundamental shift, an attempt by him. And actually, the whole system needs to adapt to this kind of, he actually fundamentally thinks differently about what our CCM system is, what the party system is, the way Tanzania works. And it's such an incredible clash, and God knows where it's going, but it definitely creates a huge amount of, forgive me the word, ambiguity in terms of what the hell can we do now? Because it's actually unclear now where actually, is at all layers, does everybody now really believe Mr. Magufuli in terms of what's going on? Or actually are we still in the old Tanzania that we knew and we could get things done? And where are we? And so it's this kind of equilibrium of expectations as well as kind of material conditions.
Any reflections or further thoughts?
Maybe one or two reactions to what Lant said. And as a matter of fact, I'm in full agreement with what he said. I think that the issue of, first, when he said that make sure that you got the growth diagnostic right or not wrong, okay, fine, that's not easy. In any country, I've seen many growth diagnostic exercises which were not really very convincing, and when you are trying to do your own, you realize that you need really put together many things. Yeah. And this is not with a simple model. that has been has been presented by the author, that you can go extremely far. But I think that one thing which is quite important in what he said, and I would have liked to also mention that, is the issue that all this reflection that we may have on what is going on in the country, the political diagnostic, institutional diagnostic, economic diagnostic, we know that they will not be shared by everybody. But if we put it on the table, if it is known, it is public information, I think that we are making a big progress. Maybe this is the only thing we can do from outside, maybe. And we simply have to hope that what we said, our analysis, one day or another will be picked up by somebody, say, oh, there was a good idea there. Now that I have a little more political power or economic power, then we will be able to implement that. But it is quite important for this to be present somewhere. And this, I believe, is implicit in Lant's intervention, and I think it must be emphasized. Another point which I think is also quite important is in this institutional politics, economics literature, the evidence that is available, and I'm not sure that I would use evidence with really a lot of quotes on both sides, because I'm not sure it is evident. I mean, people rely on cross-national, on cross-sectional data, and it does not make very much sense. I mean, it's first, I mean, you cannot say anything about a specific country looking at the result of a cross-country regression. That's the first point. And second, the causality behind the phenomena that you are analyzing is completely opaque. It's not there. I mean, it is correlation, not causality. So I'm not sure that we learn anything from this. And I think it is quite important in this debate to keep in mind that many people have this kind of comparison in mind. Having said that, and this is again something that Lant mentioned, having a list of experiences, reforms in many countries in the world is something interesting. I mean, because this may be a list from which people might decide that, okay, they did that in this country, it seemed to work. Would it be possible to do it in this country? Would there be any chance that this would be working? I think in many cases it is quite inspiring to have foreign examples. Mm-hmm. And a last point on what Stefan said about Magufuli in Tanzania. One thing which is quite interesting. I mean, everybody has heard about the fact that Tanzania is becoming a bit authoritarian. Okay, not to say more than that, to be politically correct. But trying to think about this, I realize that many of the things which he has done and which are really very much criticized belong to or are because of his main goal, which is to fight corruption. Mm. And because of that, he has to do several things. So, for example, he was very much attacked when he stopped the operation of a mining company. And he was told, oh, but you are destroying all the incentives for foreign investment to come in, etc. The business climate is becoming terrible. But at the same time, he was doing that precisely to fight against corruption coming from that big company. So I think this is quite interesting in the sense that in that case, you have a policy which is addressing a very specific institutional and political issue. But at the same time, this policy is producing spillovers on other institutions, which may be considered as completely negative. Yeah. And this is a very, very interesting case.
Can I just add something to this? It's also this question that Lant was telling you about, you know, for whom are these diagnostics for, and what you're commenting on. So I totally agree with you, François, and that it's important to bring this to the open. And this is actually going back to experience the time at DFID, and Nick Lees here, who pioneered diagnostics in DFID, to bring it back. So actually, one of the great things of doing these exercises was, first of all, to bring people within an institution on the same page by making it public, to actually inviting others, as Lant was implying, to agree and to disagree. Because one of the big things is that I definitely notice in terms of why we often so ineffective as outsiders in these places, is that everybody has fundamentally a different diagnostic about what's going on. And so actually getting these explicit and doing these exercises, actually both outsiders and insiders, bring them much more on the same hymn sheet, in terms of at least we may not agree what needs to be done, but bringing them together into some way of doing it. There's a huge role to that.
That's very useful. Kunal, do you want to?
I mean, I think the problem also is, that when we started out with the growth diagnostic, we had this diagnostic tree, right? Which is, in a sense, it's about observable phenomena, property rights, credit markets, whatever. But if you what we are saying, and the work that I did with Lant, is if a lot of stuff is happening outside the observable phenomena, if it's deals. So if you're not, so if the fixation is doing business, what's on paper, but what's really happening is far away from that, then how do we get to diagnostics, right? So in fact, talking to government officers or talking to private sector officials and even doing surveys is not very useful. You actually got to go right in, and often what they say to you in a 9 to 5 office setting and what they will say to you outside of that is very different, right? So how do we do diagnostics when what we can't observe? And we can't really see things which is happening, which is far more important than what's out there in terms of what is observable. And that's where the challenge, I think, is. And I think that's exactly why I feel that doing surveys or those sorts of things may not be as interesting as going to a slum in Dar es Salaam and talking to the slum dwellers and saying, how do you get your, how do you make sure that you get your deal? Who's the slumlord who's important there? How does that happen? That might be more important. I think that's exactly why I think this tension there is, because we go and tend to look for things we can see, but a lot of stuff we are actually are relevant, we can't really see in the sense of being absolutely in front of us.
I think you're picking up and how things happen. So we're just in a moment, Sue, and then actually what has already started is turns out that different people from different disciplines use different words to describe very similar things.
Yeah.
So I'm hearing fixity and common knowledge, and it's almost a narrative about dialogue. You could almost stick somebody who does linguistics in there. But let's bring in Lant at this point. Lant, you have...
Yeah, just one thing is that just a bit of history. The origin of the HRV diagnostic tree was that Hausman, Roderick Velasco, and myself had all gone to El Salvador, spent a week talking with various people about why El Salvador had been stagnating in growth for the last 5 years, in spite of having done lots of orthodox-looking reforms. And the four of us were sitting in a little conference room, and each of us was basically arguing for a different interpretation of what we all had heard and experienced, and that we were all looking at the same data. And we actually said, we need a way of organizing the causal hypothesis and a way of organizing the evidence so that we make sure that that if we're going to say my hypothesis is this is a binding constraint to growth, we are specifying the model under which that would be true, and then we're saying let's look at all of the features and all of the evidence. So another important element of a diagnostic is to make sure that there's consistent evidence in the economy you're looking at for the story you're telling. Because oftentimes what people will do is they'll seize on one thing. And so François was saying people were using cross-national regressions to say, on average, the coefficient suggests this factor is associated with growth, and then moving too quickly to polygenetic diagnostics. So what we came up with is basically saying, here are the nodes, each of which represents a story of a given binding constraint. And then what we developed eventually was what we call 5 column. There's 5 different fundamental ways and sources of evidence that would say, if it were the case that this were the binding constraint, here are the 5 things we should see in the economy. And if we don't see all 5, or if we see 1 and not 4, then we should look for a way of organizing all of the evidence rather than one person saying, well, it's macro because look, interest rates are high, and one person saying, well, look, it's crime because crime rates are high. We want to say, if it were the case that crime were the impetus behind low investment, there should be 5 different elements of the economy we should see. So again, I think it's an important function of organizing all of the evidence in a coherent way so that different people can come to agreement. Because even the 4 of us who shared enormous amounts of disciplinary training and enormous shared visions of the world weren't able to come to an agreement until we actually sat down and said, let's specify a node, and then let's say, what are all of the ways in which we should look for evidence about this node, rather than going to growth regressions that are just kind of generic or going to one particular feature. So I think that's the second thing about diagnostics, is it's got to provide a way that forces people to provide all of the evidence or a bulk of the evidence, rather than just say, well, we need to have financial sector reform because, well, we know financial sector reform is important. Or, when we ask firms, they say they're credit constrained, therefore we know financial sector reform is important. It's like, no, let's, if financial sector reform were in fact a binding constraint to growth, we should see at least 5 different things. And if we don't see all 5 of them, it might be a constraint to growth, but probably not the highest priority. So I just wanted to.
Thank you very much. Sue, would you like to go practical on some of the dimensions of how?
Sure.
10 minutes?
Yep. And I'll try and be brief. Is it okay with you if I sit? Can you hear me? Great. I mentioned that I was speaking specifically or thinking from the urban scale. And that's obviously a really important question for economists in a context where we make the argument that cities are central to growth. It's probably, for those of us who are interested in cities just in and of themselves, important to get things right, not to get them wrong. And it's absolutely essential at moments of massive transition, as we are seeing in cities at the moment, to ensure that the kinds of prioritization that we are implementing is the right prioritization, that we get people on board. The difficulty with cities, and why diagnostics are so important and why it would be really useful to have a wider conversation about them, is that cities bring together complexity on complexity. Okay? So it's an interesting space to have this discussion, because there are already a number of diagnostic traditions which operate in the urban space. It's one where we would welcome much more active engagement from economists, particularly if it's an open-ended discussion around diagnostics. But it is one where we already have people who practice diagnostics. And I think that's really useful for us to think about, partly because it shows us that there are these very different traditions which have probably got competing rationalities to them. So, for example, health, okay, been a fundamental driver of the way interventions in cities have been thought about, made, prioritized. The logic, at least initially, was quite an environmental understanding of health, and it turned on the basis of antibiotics to a very biomedical intervention. It's no longer that rationality, and the diagnostics about what constitutes health in a city and what should be done are once more opening up to consider much wider kinds of environmental factors. Okay? We were talking earlier about the air pollution in Delhi as a really good example of that. I personally find the difference in tradition between town planning and environmental management really, really interesting. So town planning is dedicated to the question of what should we do, what information should we take into account, and therefore what should we prioritize. Because the entire rationality of planning is to predict and to create certainty and to avoid conflict. It doesn't, or to minimize conflict. Okay, so that's what they're seeking to do. By contrast, environmentalists or scientists, natural scientists who work in the urban space, typically work from a very different assumption. They work from the assumption of doing no harm and the precautionary principle. Okay, so they're not interested in avoiding conflict. They're interested in avoiding development, because they're interested in protection. And so the information that they gather, the way that they make decisions, the norms that they base those diagnostic tools on are actually really, really different, okay? And I think it's what economists have to realize when they're coming into that space, and what you realize in cities is that there's a space for the specialist. You have to have people who understand nitrogen flows in the city. You have to have people who understand land and development in the city. You have to have people who understand the outbreaks of disease. But the ontological and epistemological points of departure are not the same. And yet if you are sitting in local government, or if you are sitting in the Treasury trying to make the decisions about what to do to make Dar es Salaam work so that Tanzania will thrive, you are actually going to have to think about those things in sectoral or professional or disciplinary terms, but you're probably also going to have to think about them in the round. And so the difficulty at the moment, and where there is quite a lot of debate in the urban space, is around how do you come to what we might think of as an urban science? How do you come to Steven, to use your medical analogy, for me it's the internal medicine specialist. It's the person who understands what happens when you have a pharmacological reaction based on some underlying conditions. And so you begin to understand the interplay of these different things. But it doesn't undermine necessarily the fundamentally different traditions which exist, which are quite specialized, and where in fact there are really competing ideas. The logic of epidemiology is quintessentially statistical. Okay? It's locked into scientific method. The logic of planning is locked into law and jurisprudence, probably more actively. These are not the same knowledge systems, but they both operate in a space simultaneously. And so where the urban community are at is in a very active discussion of how do you begin to bring these things together. And the bit that is missing is the bit about the economy. And clearly you can't talk about a city unless you talk about an economy. Where really, other than the argument that the economy is about agglomeration and encouraging agglomeration, it's a very crude diagnostic, in other words, which focuses on density and concentration. How do you begin to bring these things together? And so to sort of wind that into, so where do I think there are some good examples? Just very briefly. The two that for me are at the moment the most useful heuristic devices, and there is no successful example, I don't think. Our project that we're currently involved in, based here out of Oxford actually, a GCRF project known as Peak Urban. And the peak urban refers not just, of course, to the fact that we're at peak urban, but the P, E, A, and the K stand for 4 things. And I find them useful as a device for bringing these things together. And all it says is basically, the P is simply what in science is known as the predictive. Okay, so what are the long-term trends? The thick description I think you were talking about. How do we have as thick a possible as description of what is going on the ground as possible, from the slum dweller right through to the longitudinal statistics? What are the trends? The E is what are the emergent properties that we see? So reading across, yes, what are conflicting rationalities? What are divergent epistemologies? What are fractured professional practices? What are the things that bubble up to the surface? We know those. We're not using our resources very well. We have inequality. So we can begin to, but how do we actually get to those things across there? So what are the emergent things that we think should be informing our priorities? Then the P is how do these things get put down in practice? How do they get embedded institutionally? Because that's that point about you can't change everything all at once. You get stuck with old laws, you get stuck with old professions, you get stuck with things that work in particular kinds of ways. So what's the uneven palimpsest that emerges institutionally and in terms of capacity that we have to work with? I think Lance was mentioning that you've got to work with what is possible. And then finally the K is how do we share that knowledge? The point that you were making is that actually we can't impose experience X from experience Y The trends will have been different, the emergent properties will have been different, how it got embedded in practice might not be the same. Nonetheless, there are ways that we can talk in generic terms about the processes which are formative of how we shape cities. And I think it's in that context that one has to actually then begin to start talking about the relative weight that you give to those things. So it's not settled, but I find it a useful thing. And the other is just very, very quickly, is the idea that, again, the medics use, which is of this idea of translational research. In other words, research which is problem-solving oriented, not a solution. Right? I hear you completely and I agree. But what the medics do is that they say, if we want to reduce cardiac failure, we're going to have to design a new valve. Okay? And they get everybody from the patients to the engineers to the nurses to the everybody to work on that solution, on the research to implement and assess and refine. And I think it's those kinds of diagnostic tools that really then will begin to start being helpful. That's the urban stuff. It's a messy space, so it doesn't work very well.
Thank you very much. Stefan,
Right.
translation, knowledge, experience.
Oh, whatever it is, yes. I hope I'm going to satisfy what it is. So I was interpreting also the question that was asked is a bit like, how are we going to now use both broad space of evidence, the diagnostics work, and, I think we're in a room here with people that don't just want to do diagnostics for the sake of diagnostics, but they want to start doing something, some interventions, some doing it. And I was kind of trying to reflect on some of the things, being myself, a fan of doing careful diagnostics in the way that many of you have discussed here. And I was reminded last night, thinking about what shall I do, that I'm the lucky owner of a really old house. Okay, and it's a really nice house, but the floors are all uneven. And the walls are made of a mixture of mud and cement and bricks. And it has one of these things that arguably maybe has in common with many houses in this country, is that the plumbing is very 19th century. And so I have a problem actually, and indeed I have had a problem for almost as long as we live in it, with leaky taps. And that's really something that has troubled me. So not so long ago, we tried to bring in a builder, a very distinguished, well-known builder, and said, can we renovate some of these things and can we do something about the plumbing? And this builder was really interesting because he walked around and said, oh, beautiful house, I love these old houses and all the things, and he was describing me all the architecture. And I said, can you do something about the plumbing? I said, no, come on, just live with it. This is how it is. It's an old building. You knew when you bought it, this is ultimately probably a 17th century building. That's it. You can't really do much about it. I got then another builder in, and he very quickly got his pencil out and made me a quote and say, look, I'll fix it. And so he came in, started doing all kinds of things. He took quite a bit of the taps apart, then went on 3 weeks on a holiday to Ibiza, and then came back and put them back together. And great, because I had one leaky tap, and now that tap is repaired, but I have 2 new leaky taps. So that's the kind of thing. So I did a little bit what, people who know me would think I may well end up doing, is that I ended up watching a lot of YouTube videos, and I carefully checked, and I got carefully the steps that I had to do to disassemble thing. I even got the tools delivered. I managed to do it, and anyway, I carefully looked at it and so on. I'll tell you later what happened next. But I just want to actually say, because there is an analogy in terms of how we often work and what we are doing in development with some of these things. We do meet these builders who tell us, that, well, history matters and that's it, or indeed tell you that's the political settlement, live with it, that's it. Just take it. Or indeed, we can read why nations fail and try to think through what is now the policy advice that Dercon and Jim are telling us, and say, well, just buy yourself another history. That's it. In my case, you're stuck with that house, that's it. You can keep on trying what you do, that's it. Surely we wouldn't be development practitioners to actually be willing to do this. So the other builder I got, did remind me of, and forgive me, it's never OPM, but a consultant coming in and actually quickly saying, surely I've done this in another place here, and quickly make a quote, that could be some kind of thing, and here is the best practice that we do. We take this apart, put it back together, and that's it, and we'll do it. My approach, of course, is, and I only realized this morning that, this is the economist as a plumber. As François' former student put, and of course she won a Nobel Prize for it. And
not for that.
but he's saying, you keep on watching these best, beautifully prepared little YouTube videos, and I like, as a researcher, I love making them. I do RCTs, I do that stuff, and you make them. And then I'm standing there with my leaky tap and say, oh, well, keep on finding the relevant YouTube video and actually say, look, I'll just follow that advice. And then, arguably, I'll tell you later what happened next. But you're here talking about something quite different. And it reminded me is actually, you're talking the economist as a chartered surveyor. Basically doing a fairly careful structural survey of your building, and trying to think through, as a proper structural engineer, getting all the elements that you need to get understand of the structure and put it all together. Now, does that repair my tap? Now, that's the last thing I want to briefly talk about, is that it makes me think, because the chartered surveyor can make you a beautiful report and get you all the details of the political economy, societal things, and we can make it richer and richer, and we kind of should be doing it. I don't think that simply saying, my constraint is here, my old plumbing, there is probably a washer that is something loose there as well, and my other constraint is a very old building, we're not quite sure how it responds, is going to be enough. And Kunal was saying, look, understand the constraints. It doesn't tell me what will happen now if I start to fix it. And, he won't be able to, the report won't be able to tell me what will now happens next when someone starts tackling some of the constraints. I mean, one of the things, of course, by doing this is that, there is not, we may say that's the most important constraint, but it's not so clear where we'll go do it, because a structural survey of a building is not the same as a structural model of the building, of actually a description of how actually the whole thing works. It can identify some of the features, but it is not a causal model, as François was also implying. So it still makes you think about, look, do we invest so much in getting the better and better structural engineering, or is this somehow, maybe there is a limit to how far we need to go with that? I'm not trying to say I have the answer, but what it doesn't do is really telling you what happened next. And so if you think through it now, I now have my structural survey. Probably it's not a bad idea for me still to read it very carefully and assume that I'm competent now to watch the YouTube videos. It probably tells me some of the things that probably make sense to do. So there is something there. I can use some of the broader evidence base as well. But will I really know how this now all will work through? Well, will I know what me shocking the system will do? Will it know what that actually will be happening? I would argue it's definitely not sufficient, and there is still something there. Because, and this is the thing that definitely in my experience working in development has been more and more striking me, is that this is still ex-ante analysis. We do all before things start happening, and we're investing all the time in more and more sophisticated ex-ante analysis, while we're then implementing, we're crap. Sorry, I know this is live stream. Shouldn't have said this. Anyway, but this is actually, we are not really investing enough in thinking through what now do we need to do while we're now trying to fix it. What are we doing? Where's the signs of monitoring? Where is the signs of monitoring? There is none. We can keep on building on terms of the identification. There is virtually no proper science of how do you monitor and how do you learn. I know Lant is probably still in the line. I know he's also written about it. And we should keep on thinking about, because clearly I want my structural survey. I probably will watch my YouTube videos with some ideas of what I can try to do. I may dismiss them because say, look, they're not relevant given my structural survey, or then maybe I'll just have to start experiment in trying to fix it. But then I need to learn to do actually something about what's going on. And so we should be very careful to say, the more we do ex ante, we can create a certainty. The more we can do it. Maybe we'll need to build some form of not just a structural survey, but a bit of a minimal structural model of what we have. Now, I don't mean it literally, but of course that's what people say in evaluation or in monitoring things, proper theory of change. Now, start with the information. You have to think through very carefully, and then not just waffle about a theory of change as we usually do, but actually start thinking about it. What do I now need to monitor? Not so much that I would need to see whether these are the 5 constraints that are present, but that I start seeing to change now if I was actually right initially what these were my constraints. And if then you start seeing, look, this is not shifting, you'll need to probably start revisiting. So this is a big appeal to actually say, look, do this stuff, but know your limit. More and more investing in ex-ante analysis, I don't think we're going to be better at dealing with reality over time. It's helpful. Maybe we don't need to keep on further and further. We want to know about political, institutional and historical context and about the economy, but we also need to start thinking about what happened next. We need to find a way to actually use that information to say, what is it now that we need to start monitoring to go further? So what happened with my tab? Well, despite the best possible YouTube videos, I clearly have my own understanding of all these things were kind of minimal. Okay, I still have a leaky tap. It's a bit less, actually, interesting, exactly as you would have predicted with watching these videos. Probably there's going to be a bit of an effect. It's definitely small, much smaller than the original ITT that the video had suggested, the treatment effect that they had suggested. There is still there, and it started leaking again. So clearly, I don't quite get it. But some will say, oh, as long as we keep on building that YouTube library, one day we'll have for all possible scenario and cases a solution. That's of course going to be another way of doing it. I don't think so. I think, let's be eclectic, let's combine, let's learn these things, but let's also make sure we start thinking much more carefully, how do we invest in learning while we're doing in a scientific way and not just argue about what is the nature of the ex-ante analysis that we should do. Thank you.
Thank you. Steven.
Thanks. So, I'm Stevan Lee from OPM. I organised the agenda. I'm very pleased with it so far. Thank you very much, everybody. I think we can see that bringing extra dimensions into diagnostics is really complicated. The good news is, I think in a particular country, quite often some really brilliant people have done quite a lot of work on parts of the issues. So I'm going to talk through Thicker Diagnostics, which is is supposed to be a really pragmatic but consistent framework for putting together evidence from different types of analysis and thinking about options. I'm going to explain the approach and I'll talk through an example from India. That's my first slide. Okay, so this is the diagnostic space, and it shows how different sorts of economic and political features fit together. And on the right, we've got the economy, which is where the normal growth diagnostic would be done. The classic Hausman-Roderick-Velasco diagnostic sort of takes place there. It's all about producers whose behavior creates production and consumption and prices. And the question is, what are the big allocative efficiency issues that are impeding investment and growth? And then there are some other economic bits that we put in. So top right, we've got a dynamic idea about industrial evolution, what firms do now affects their capabilities, what they're going to do in the next period. So it's more dynamic. and that can affect investment and growth too. And sometimes there'll be analysis in a particular country which will say that's really important for growth. So John Sutton would often say that's important. We've got Antonio and Andrioni in the room. I think he would often say that's really important. At the bottom, we've got some public sector producers as well as just firms, so that's including service delivery, and we've got assets, including human capital, and often there's a story about human capital, which is apparently really important for growth in a particular place. And they can be sort of appendage to the normal growth diagnostic, I think. And one thing to note about this is that policy is sort of outside this model. It's exogenous. So the growth diagnostic would tell you about a cost or a damaging dynamic that you want to sort out. You can have a policy to address it. If you introduce a policy to tackle a cost, like expensive electricity or something, it's going to have secondary effects in production and prices, the things within the model. But there's not going to be secondary effects back onto policy if you restrict your analysis to this sort of way of thinking. So we just need to keep that in mind. Okay, so over on the other side, we've got power. Political actors and groups hold power in some sort of coalition, a political settlement. The actors with power make rules in formal and informal institutions, the rules for the economy. There are lots of ways of characterizing and analyzing political economy and institutions. But if we focus on the commonalities, a lot of the approaches suggest that the powerful actors design institutions necessarily really to reinforce their power. So via the economy, which is this black box so far. So Douglas North, Acemoglu and Robinson, Tim Kelsall do this, Mushtaq Khan does it in different ways. You can do it in quite a Marxist way. You can think about institutions in different ways, but this power, rules, economy, back to power dynamic is very common. Not all power is right at the top of the hierarchy in the country, so you can have power at household and community level that can generate different sort of rules, social norms, but again, they can reinforce power via the economy, and they can have a lot of impact on people's lives and on growth and poverty. And notice here, policy has been brought into the model on this side. So where we say where it comes from, which is power, and we might not say much about it, how it works. On the economic model, we say how it works, but not where it's come from. So that's what we put them together. On the right, we've got constrained behavior of producers leading to outcomes. On the left, we've got powerful actors designing the rules of the economy to reinforce the power, and they kind of meet here at institutions and policy. There's lots of causes going from left to right. That's what these arrows represent. And there are also feedback loops. We haven't really put all the possible feedback loops in, but there's plenty of them possible. The economic diagnostic doesn't really have feedback loops, and it's quite static. But putting them in makes a lot of difference. And so to actually use this for a diagnostic, you assemble good information, probably that other people have done, about features on both sides, and you spot the causal relationships, the sort of the partial causal relationships between one feature and another, including the feedback loops. Most of the big economic problems are going to have immediate causes, but they're going to have institutional and political causes behind that, and they're going to feed into the political and social foundations as well. So there's a kind of balance, and if you think of the logic of that, we're saying that you can have an intervention or a policy change aimed at an economic problem, but to succeed, there's going to need to be at least a minor disruption in politics or social structures if the impact's going to be sustained. And the other possibility is you have your intervention, there are secondary effects in institutions and policy, but they just neutralize the impact of your intervention or your policy change. And the social structures and the political settlement don't change. They're not disrupted. That's a big difference from the purely economic diagnostic, I would say. Right, so India is a rather ambitious example country, but we actually did this in 2018 for a client. Obviously, it's very complicated. Luckily, the study was for the Gates Foundation, so they were really very interested in human development and the economy, so we could skew the analysis towards that and make it a bit partial. I mean, my idea about using the work of others is tricky in India, only because there's so much work in India, but you can't read all of it. You read good stuff, take ideas that several sources agree about, or seem really important, and then second to check it with people who know the country well. So instead of putting all the features that we spot straight into that diagnostics space diagram, which is really for showing results rather than doing analysis, there isn't room, we use this sort of matrix. So it's a bit like an input-output matrix, if that helps. Will help some of us. We list features grouped as sort of foundational, institutional, produces outcomes down in the rows, and then again along the top in columns. So they're all represented at both sides. And then we put a little arrow where there's an important sort of causal link between two features, between a row and a column. So for example, the existence of highly disempowered groups produces a bias against investment in the health of women and girls at a household level. And then that continues, that household level bias creates low investment in human capital overall, along with some other things. We put this diagonal in, and the arrows to the top and right of the diagonal are going from left to right in the diagnostic space. Oh.
I've lost the television.
Well. The arrows beneath are feedback loops.
Are you able to go for a couple of minutes without?
Well, I can. It's getting very visual now, though.
Yeah, just push the two together, I agree. Be careful, man who's watched YouTube, eh?
Yes, exactly. I can blow up the whole thing.
So I'll be careful not to tread too heavily. Yeah, below it's feedback loops. So there we've got one: low demand for urban labour feeds back into that social bias against investing in women and girls at household level. Okay, so we assemble a lot of those for India and start. The results can be displayed in the diagnostic space. And if we'd only looked at the right-hand side, this is what we would have found. We would have found a few very large formal firms and millions of tiny micro enterprises. Formal firms having about 60 times the capital intensity of the tiny enterprises. And so that's distorted investment and growth. It's causing low urban labour demand. It has an impact on the industrial revolution story as well, because nearly all the productivity gains are coming in the big formal firms. And then the second feature on the right is really spectacularly low public financing of social services, especially health, which causes human development outcomes that are more like those of a much poorer country in India. And it also contributes, therefore, to low supply of labour. And in a way, that's the growth diagnostic, or it's the parts of growth diagnostic we do if we're only thinking about human development and growth. A missing middle, low human capital problem. And if we leave it at the growth diagnostic, we might look at ways to help the micro enterprises graduate and formalise, and we might look at more investment for health. But then moving left, we've got some other features to put in over here in foundations. So the first one, there's a sort of self-protective elite bargain, at least historically, where elite groups use power to create a lot of economic advantage for themselves. So there's corruption, but there's also a lot of asymmetric rules, one set of rules for elite enterprises, another for the rest. And of course, in the end, that causes this missing middle that we already observed. So the formal firms aren't just big, they're owned by a political group or a class, which is a bit different. Second, all that makes politics a high-stakes game in India. So but there are also elections, and the elite need a strategy for winning elections, and they come up with clientelism. So historically, that's basically just buying votes. Latterly, it's more rewarding voters with private goods like handouts and subsidies. And that means that government funds a lot of those instead of investing in public goods like infrastructure and social services. So that reinforces the missing middle because it creates a lot of costs for most enterprises, and it reinforces the low human capital problem as well. And then finally, we've got highly disempowered groups down at the bottom here. So every country has disempowered groups, but in India they're very large, they're very disempowered. They lead to social norms which produce that bias against investment in households, in women and girls that I mentioned, but they also produce biases in service delivery, so that women and girls and people of low caste get a very raw deal in service delivery, public and private, and that feeds into very low human capital outcomes, especially in those groups. That's reinforced by the latter-day clientelism, partly because of the investment in the low investment in health, but also because all these subsidies and handouts, they're very easy to access in the rural areas, much harder to access in urban areas, so that kind of contributes to a low urban supply of labour, probably contributes to the missing middle. So in the end, we've got these two, the pink and the blue, two big chains of effects, the missing middle and the low human capital rural trap, and they reinforce each other in lots of ways. So together they produce high returns to some people's capital, to elite capital, and very low returns to labour, and that is the sort of classic politically strengthening feedback loop. And by the way, that means that attempts to deal with the missing middle, say by helping some small firms formalise and become established, they're only going to work with some sort of institutional or political disruption, because they're going to change outcomes. That's going to have an impact here. And that's, so either the elite decide they don't need as much protection as they used to.
Do you want to just do a quick wrap up on it?
No, I can do it. Either the elite decide they don't need as much protection as they thought they had before. They concede some economic and political ground to others, and the interventions to help the small businesses work, or they don't work because the elite want to preserve their protection, so there'll be adjustments in institutions, in those asymmetric business institutions, to neutralise the intervention, and so that the political settlement and the social structures stay the same, so there's no disruption. And that's the kind of choice we've got. Low human capital trap, it's got even more reinforcing feedbacks. Maybe we won't be able to show them, but okay. Poor skilled labour supply reinforces the missing middle. The low demand from urban labour plus severe discrimination in the labour market, by the way, which comes from the social norms, is really reinforcing of the social norms, but also this bias against investment in household investment in women and girls. A lot of countries have a missing middle, but this low human capital trap in India is a bit more in Indian specific and a bit more insidious possibly. And it creates tricky messages for some experts advising on health. So, using evidence about what works from other settings might not work very well when there's all these layers of deep causes of problems like poor investment in poor people in rural states. And so, for example, if you think about investing in maternal and child health, it seems like a great idea, well-targeted external intervention, and doubtless will have some impact. But to succeed in levelling up the health of those disempowered women and girls, that implies a disruption to the social structure, and that might be very slow, like Sue said, and we should expect resistance, therefore, at the household level, service delivery level, and in the labour market. And then really also to increase health spending requires some disruption in the political settlement, because politics in most of these states has got different spending priorities. So it's quite likely that an investment in maternal and child health is going to produce an offsetting adjustment in public investment in similar things, unless some further deal is brokered. So it's tougher findings than a purely economic growth diagnostic, but I think a bit more accurate.
Thank you.
Okay.
What I want to ask is if there's any immediate thoughts on those three contributions from the panel. We can check in with Lant, but it would be, I think, time to open it up. We've got lots of people who I hope have lots of good questions or contributions in the room. So any burning reflections or thoughts from the panel? Okay, thank you. Would anybody like to contribute? Yes, please, David.
I found all this very impressive. And it's clearly the case if we think of a country as a very complicated system with a lot of impediments and deficiencies, that a country-specific approach is indicated. So I'm fully on board for the country diagnostic analysis of the type that we've been hearing. But the trouble is that a lot of these effects are terribly, they're qualitative, they're quite hypothetical in terms of their impact. For example, we know that high degrees of corruption are pretty bad for efficiency mostly, but in some cases countries seem able to cope quite well with high levels of corruption. In other cases it's really very much more debilitating. So the interesting question is quite why a perceived impediment is more problematic in some cases than others. And it seems to me it comes back a bit to Stefan's point, one of Stefan's points, other than about taps, that this country diagnostic approach could usefully be complemented by something not unlike Lant's work on growth episodes, but where you look at in detailed cross-country comparisons between various types of attempted reforms, which in some cases worked quite well, in other cases didn't, and then couple that with the country diagnostic information to see if one could get a better explanation as to why some succeeded and some failed. So, examples would be setting up a revenue authority. Sometimes that worked quite well, sometimes it didn't. Reforming foreign direct investment arrangements. Again, sometimes that worked really quite well, sometimes it didn't. And it's not clear that it's just the level of the country, per capita income or anything else. It's something in the detail of the sort the diagnostic is trying to address. So I'd have thought there's a sort of complementary research program which would be very usefully coupled with this exercise.
Thank you.
Thanks. I thought Stefan's example, bumping
Sorry,
example.
I've been remiss. I know David, so I should have asked David to introduce himself as David Bevan, but Trochis, no, David, I've done it for you, don't worry. Trochis, could you just introduce yourself so that everybody knows your name and where you're based?
Sure.
Thank
Hi,
you.
I'm Trochis. I work at OPM in the education team. I thought Stefan's example was going to go a different direction, but I had a question just around that dynamic. A lot of the discussion today around diagnostic still seems to treat the process of diagnostic itself as technical. You are including all these other things around politics, etc. But who does the diagnostic, how you do it, when you do it, that seems to not have come out at all. And I wonder if that's actually something that needs to be thought about more, which could help address some of the challenges for why diagnostic are not working, because it's often very expert-driven, sort of outsider-led. At most, sort of country participation seems to be like as data point or as participants, but not really taking ownership over that process. And so it would be useful to hear on the who does it, when you do it, how you do it aspect of diagnostic as well.
Thank you. Do you want to pick that up?
I'd quite like to come in on that.
Sue, do, yeah.
Just very briefly, I mean, I was rushing towards the end, but that for me is the advantage of a translation approach to diagnostics, is that in a sense it's not so much problem driven in the sense of finding a solution, but where there's a consensual coming together that things are not working, and therefore the appropriate parties and stakeholders, so sometimes called co-production, sometimes called whatever, those kinds of things, but it's implicitly that. And it does speak that, the problem for that is that it speaks to the scale question, because that's very rarely a national process. It is almost always a much more local process. And the difficulty is that there's a mismatch between diagnostic tools and the data that we use and the evidence that we require at the scales at which people are concerned, and where interventions will be made. So I think we're on the cusp of overcoming that. I think that the data stuff is becoming much more flexible. And as a result, I think our approach to the process of diagnostic interventions, whether they're planning or economic or any other kind, can begin to shift. But that's precisely for me where that commitment to what I would call a translational approach really does help.
Can I just add to it, is that we should just be, we can love all the co-creation and so on in that respect. Of course, we start touching on some of the highly sensitive political economy things. And so I was very amused when the World Bank started doing also diagnostics at the SEDs. And so I remember reading one clearly one, it's still on the web, on a particular country where both the military and cronies was typically the way you would describe the regime, and that these words never appeared anywhere. There was not a single bit of analysis of the role of the military in that economy as a result, because it had to be a joint document with the military. So you have to be just, you just have to be realistic that you can't just not just hope for that all the time.
Yes, I simply wanted to respond to David. And I completely agree with what he said. But in what I described, precisely, I mean, to have experiences with different countries, different case studies, on the issue of corruption, for example, the question is, among the discussion among the authors of the 4 case studies is, how does corruption work in your case? What is the impact, or what is the cause of corruption? And is it the same thing in this other country? And I can tell you that we will not find that the corruption has the same impact and that the same analysis in the 4 countries. And on your final point, this is exactly what we have in mind. Assuming that there will be some extension to this project, I hope it will be the case. We have exactly in mind to try to connect those in-depth case studies with the existing literature in other countries to see whether we find something similar or not. But to put it more in the perspective of what we know, in particular historically, not historically in the long past, but over the last 3 or 4 decades.
Thank you. Alan.
Alan Rowe, I'm an old lag from OPM and also the World Bank, so forgive me for being an old lag. Francois' story about...
I am also the old guy.
Julius' story reminded me of a similar story you could tell about Julius Nyerere when he nationalised the banks in 1967 in Tanzania without consulting a single person who might be able to tell him something at all about what the implications of nationalising banks would have been. But my point was the following. I think we come into diagnostics because we I think believe implicitly, I suppose with a degree of arrogance, that we want the diagnostic because we can do better things in the future in the countries where we are trying to assist development and poverty reduction. And I think in that context it's perhaps helpful to think of the sort of structure of institutions that Oliver Williamson used to refer to, where we have things that we definitely can change as external interveners, and other things we definitely cannot change. And I think that taxonomy, I'm sure it's involved in your project, starts with social mores and conventions and expectation, which are extremely difficult to change, except, as Susan says, in a very long term. Then you've got formal laws and regulations, which you can change. You know, I worked in the World Bank on the former Soviet Union. It was amazing how easy it was if you're offering £100 million of World Bank loans to change a law. It was incredibly easy. We can all do that. The third thing is the capacity to implement, and I think it's helpful to include in that not only technical capacity, which is the ability of your regulator, Ewira in Tanzania, to understand how to regulate power prices and so on, but also the corruption element, because I think the capacity is intervened by corruption. I think corruption is a sort of deviation from capacity. If you like, well-trained people, unfortunately, they're corrupt. And then you've introduced the final point, Francois, which is the random element. I don't buy the argument Mr. Magufuli is a wise man trying to end corruption. I think he's a random element, poorly educated in economics, who actually believes, and you read his speech after that decision you referred to, you read his speech, he actually believed that by controlling the prices of electricity, he would help poor people. He actually believes it, because he's poorly trained in economics. So you've got a random element. So you've got social mores and so on, which you cannot change. You've got random elements, you've got degrees of capacity which you cannot change in the short run. That taxonomy, for me, is incredibly helpful if we're trying to sort of go from the diagnostic to actual policies that we believe in good faith will change things in the countries we work in.
Thank you. Kunal, did I miss?
I just want to sort of, actually going back to the earlier question, but also the question of culture. If you look at if you see the growth success stories that we see around us right now, South Korea, China, Indonesia, so on, there were big changes that happened in a very short time. Within a situation where if culture was the fixity, how did it happen that we suddenly saw in Korea, for example, this remarkable episode of growth that pretty much sustained itself for a very long time, China after development. So culture is, in a sense, something one has to be careful about, because one actually heard the story that in Asia, the cultural norms, which would not allow us to have the kind of growth that we see now at this point. So I think culture has to be kept a little bit, should be downplayed in my view, because there's a danger we can overplay culture. But coming back to the other question, which I think is important, that, so who actually owns growth diagnostics? Well, think about when Suharto comes in and thinks, okay, I have a problem here. I've seen this huge problem in my country. I get together a bunch of people, like advisors, who can see what the problem is. So you have a political elite who actually is interested in solving a problem. You have perhaps people there, economic advisors, who can tell you what the problem is. And then you get together and you solve the problem, right? We saw that in many countries where we've seen these huge rapid growth episodes. So growth diagnosis, ultimately the ownership is, in fact, the knowledge about what's wrong in a country is with essentially those who are in that country. All we can really do is give them some more advice, but ultimately when we see that, and as in Archibald Robinson kind of way, critical junctures, when things come together, right? India, 30 years of very slow growth, 1991, what happened, right? So I think ultimately our role is provide the knowledge, but when it really happens, it's very clear how that happens, because it brings together a bunch of people from the political side, economic side, other players, and that's when we see these huge increases in income in GDP per capita in very short time. So one shouldn't forget the importance of how growth diagnostics has been actually being done all the time in the successful countries we can think about. All the time they've been thinking through that. And I think there's a danger that we think we know what they don't know. They do. But that's where the challenge is for them. How do they actually do what they want to do, given the certain political realities that are there, that might be there. And then that's when things suddenly shift, and then things are possible, which wasn't possible before. So I think it's important to keep that in mind.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
I'm Paddy Carter. I work for CDC Group, which is the British Development Finance Institution, in case anybody is not familiar with them. We started with the nihilism of the Washington Consensus. And there's another idea out there which is very related to what everyone's been talking about, which I think is a bit nihilistic, which is the idea that economies are complex adaptive systems. And that means that no matter how hard you stare at them, you're not going to be able to figure out how it all fits together. You could have looked at Indonesia forever and you would never have found what happened in Lant's story. And I'm not sure whether that's right or not, but at first blush, if you are in that world, it might mean, well, you've got to throw all this stuff away. You know, your clever diagnoses are never going to be any good, but maybe you can sort of resurrect them as ways of identifying intelligent places to experiment. And that brings in what Stefan was saying about the need to learn as you're going along. But the problem with experimenting is if you get things wrong, sometimes you set your hair on fire. And so my question is, does any of this work when it comes to trying to figure out what happens if you experiment and you've got things wrong, and do you have to sort of bring risk analysis into all this?
Any thoughts or reflections?
Very briefly, I mean, I think what you are pointing to, though, is the question of why do we have diagnostic tools? And the one is about intervention, and the other is about monitoring. And I think that what we've spoken very little about, and for me what's very useful, is following some of the science that's been done and the way that they think about complex systems and around tipping points and around stresses, as well as about complex adaptive systems. And I don't think that the economy is necessarily analogous to natural systems, but complex systems thinking is different in different places and modes. And for me, what's been really interesting talking to some of the scientists is that it's very clear that there's stuff that they've known about and been aware of some of the tensions and stresses in the system. And then there are things which we just were not tracking at all. And I think that's the thing that we want to go back to and say, you know, actually, is the diagnostic tool fit for purpose? And if the purpose is to actually understand fundamental stresses that may actually take us over tipping points, then we really do need to be knowing, as well as be intervening in ways that are doing no harm, if you go back to Lance's original point about not making mistakes.
So can I just add is that, it's interesting that you use the word stresses, because it's quite similar, I think, again, language where maybe we're not meaning the same thing, or we do, but it's an interesting thing. If you do, Lant said correctly, you do your ex-ante analysis, including your diagnostics, very carefully to avoid stupid mistakes. You can start excluding things you're definitely not going to try doing, and if it means sometimes, if it's a tool to tell you don't do this, it's actually very helpful, because we do a lot in development because we see something, an outcome that's bad, so therefore we got to do something. But if we can't act on it, if we have no way of doing it, but at the same time it should tell you really, where these risks are, where are the big assumptions you make if you're going to try to make it, what will be the stresses, and that if that thing is not going to hold when I start doing this, then you keep an eye on it. Now, can I make it foolproof for the reputational risks that anything with public money that's being done to be done? Of course not. Things will go wrong, but at least you can avoid them, and you can actually have a slightly more predictive power in terms of where it's likely to go wrong and what you need to keep an eye on.
Yes, on this, the point made by Stefan earlier on, and this issue about the process. I have the feeling that we are talking about a kind of continuous diagnostic that would be necessary. But then the question about who is doing that comes in. And before that, it seems to me that one big weakness, and I'm afraid this is not only a weakness in the low-income and low-middle-income countries, it's also a weakness in our countries, is the fact that we don't have the right evaluation institutions. And the first thing that you'd like to have is, when you decide to go in one direction with a policy reform, you like to make sure that the implementation is being monitored and correctly monitored. But look, look at the experience of many countries. And one reform was decided, one law was modified, and is there anything saying, okay, where do we stand on this? Is the reform progressing as expected? What are the first results that we are seeing? This is really nothing which is, this is something which is not systematically in the public debate. And I believe this is really a big weakness, and we need to try to compensate for it.
Yeah. Thank you. Francis.
Francis, to you. I'm retired now, but I work for the CSAE. I'd like to sort of raise a more general question, which is, well, what do countries learn about their own policies? Tanzania has been mentioned a couple of times. Now, Tanzania's policies currently look very like a lot of their policies in the 1970s. Between those two events, you had a catastrophe in terms of outcomes in Tanzania. Now, the people that you want to influence in terms of your diagnostics are undoubtedly the politicians who run those countries. Now, what happened in Tanzania that ensured that the politicians learned nothing about how you run the country? Nigeria is another example where current policies are very similar to what they were 30 or 40 years ago. The politicians have learned nothing, or is it that the political structure that you see in these countries actually makes those policies attractive to a group of people? The answer in Nigeria is rather more obvious than it is in Tanzania, but if your diagnostics are going to have any actual impact, they've got to understand why the politicians do what they do. And the counterexample, obviously, which has also been mentioned, is China. China had a bigger catastrophe than any of these African countries? And was it pure chance that they learned from that if you do more or less exactly the opposite of what you've been doing for the last 20 years, it's going to be dramatically successful? I mean, those are very specific examples. What you're seeking in your diagnostics is some generality from those specifics about what it might be useful to do. And because I'm very old, I can actually remember when people believed in the Washington Consensus. So if you want a generality, which certainly applies to the 2 African cases I've mentioned, it's don't screw up your prices if you want your countries to grow.
Thank you. It's a big, yes, you did ask it. That's a very big point. Thank you.
I'm happy to, I mean, not in a big disagreement in there, but it's an interesting thing is that, you know, the one thing that we when we get older, we shouldn't forget that some of the people we deal with may not have been around while this was happening. And I have a very Francis.
Exactly the same.
Yes, and it's an interesting thing that I'm actually have and I'm not going to comment on the Tanzania thing, but there's an interesting case that at the moment I'm getting quite involved in a particular country I know reasonably well. And actually, I know that they are embarking on an economic reform program, and indeed with international institutions involved in it. And it's an interesting thing that I seem to have spent mainly them lecturing about what happened between 1989 and 94 to them, and actually trying to convince them, because there is a kind of a slight arrogance in saying, oh well, you know, of course that was then caused by, not in this particular case, but in other places that say, oh, that was just because of a structural adjustment, we're not doing that stuff and so on. So they have very simplistic narratives about what happened then and what went wrong. So I think there is still a case to keep on doing this. And the underlying point, I take your point, why do countries keep on making mistakes? But that's partly the point of the diagnostic, to bring out the political incentives to actually keep the status quo and bring them out and make it very clear. And I think then will come in quite a few African countries that I know well with conclusions that help to explain to some extent what you're saying. Not that it therefore means that we know how to change it, but that's another matter.
Any other final concluding thoughts? It's going to be
on
time
this
for
one, simply I don't think I would agree with the fact that in many countries the situation of the policies today are the same as in the 70s. No, I don't agree with that. I mean, there has been things have been learned. People in many countries have studied the past. They know about the mistakes which were made, and I don't think that we are in the same situation. Now, there may be political forces that will lead to problems, maybe similar. And think about the debt, for example. But the way in which this debt will have appeared, is not exactly the same thing as it was in the 70s. I don't agree with that.
Okay. Lant, thank you very much for joining us for so long. We're wrapping up, but do you have any things that you would like to leave us with?
So I just want to say, as we think about diagnostics, we also want to think about differential diagnostics, and we want to keep in mind that the 50 or 60 years of the development era in which people have been self-consciously doing development are the most fantastically progress years in the history of humankind by a factor of 10. We've had all kinds of success. So I sometimes think this diagnostic thing gets too much into assuming there's some deep pathology and we're having failure and we need a diagnostic. We also need to say, geez, nearly every kid in this, in 1950, 2% of kids in the developing world went to school. Now 98% do. The average infant mortality in the developing world in 1960 was, I think, on the order of 150, and now it's on the order of 40 or something. Just across the board, there's just been massive progress in certain dimensions of development. And so we want to make sure that our differential diagnostic recognizes, geez, why did we have success in this and we're having trouble in that? as opposed to always acting as if what we have to diagnose is corruption and da. It's like, I don't know, I mean, you know, and by the way, since the 1990s, we have had economic growth rates that have been absolute convergence, which we didn't have formerly. So we want to make sure that our diagnostic is, why did we succeed in what we succeeded at in a way that helps us understand why we are not yet succeeding in what we want to succeed at, because a lot of this institutional stuff gets this framing of, geez, we're stuck in low-level traps. Like, that's not a good characterization of most of the world. Like, most of the world has like sprung out of whatever traps we thought they were in, around schooling, around health, around water and sanitation, around all the key things. So we shouldn't, I don't know why we always get into this mode of, you know, talking more about failure than we're talking about success, because we want to be able to, you know, have an accurate differential diagnostic. If your model or your approach can't explain the successes, then it's not an adequate model too. And a lot of this, oh, well, you know, things are in a trap and they don't change. That's just false. I mean, just false about most of the world, most of the time.
Thank you. So,
Can I just say one concluding
yes,
point?
Of course.
I think I notice a kind of sense of pessimism right now, except Lant's more optimistic thing. But you know, look where we are now in this room, sitting here, talking politics, institutions. 10 years back, did we even do that in our growth diagnostics? 10 years back, did we do that in growth theory, right? So where we are now, we have, for all the criticism we made about Archibald Robinson or North Valley's Weingast or others, we have a body of work we can draw from, and the kind of work France is doing in the countries that you mentioned, others, we are in a much better place than we were 10 years back, and Stefan's presentation was so fascinating, really. So we got to see exactly where we are. We don't want to go back to the world where we didn't have to think about politics or institutions, much as we are trying to understand what Magufuli is doing in Tanzania, and those sort of that kind of discussion can happen. So we got to see exactly, this is an opportunity for us to try and nail down some of these very tricky questions. But that's the nature of politics institutions, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I think we got to think about the fact that we are in a much better place than we were before, and we don't want to go back to that place where we were before. And the point really is to try and build upon what exactly we can build from the work that we are already seeing, not just here among us, but also the work of the Archibald Robinson, all the great works happened in the last few years.
Thank you.
Do you want to close? No, I mean, the point I want to say is following on what Lant said. I agree. I mean, the statu quo, the situation today is certainly not a situation of despair. But the point is that, I mean, the issue in front of us is whether we can do better than what is happening today. For the moment, if we look at the future and if we look at Africa, to have a growth rate around 1.5% of GDP per capita, which means 5% overall growth rate, this is more or less the growth rate of the richest countries. And this is much less than the emerging countries, which means that if we keep with this kind of performance, those countries will not catch up. And so this is the reason why I don't think we should be too pessimistic, certainly not. But we should simply keep in mind that there is some space for improvement.
I was simply going to say that you don't want to get so good at the diagnostics of growth that you do so at the cost of all sorts of other kinds of diagnostics, not least those of natural resources. And so just to absolutely keep in mind the imperative of holding different diagnostic strategies and tools in harmony.
Thank you for that. Thank you all. We're going to wrap up. There's no sense in trying to sort of sum up and draw out big themes, but I'd like to pick up on the importance of change and the extent to which cities, as part of an urbanization process, is a transformational change. And that then leads to other things, including the sort of disruption to political settlements that challenge the equilibrium that we always seem to end up with when we build in politics and social factors into models. I think Schroeder's point, which is essentially one about legitimacy for outsiders. So we are, but not universally, but by and large, quite outsiders when we're thinking about processes of development with their intrinsic challenges of political legitimacy. And the characteristic of a diagnostic that matters is it offers some form of legitimacy to engage with the process in a country. So I'd like to thank you all, Lant, for being with us from Delhi, all of you who've travelled and joined us here, even if Stefan just came from his plumbing. It's been an enormous, intense and full conversation. We're very grateful. Thank you all for coming. There is lunch, and it's just in the room next door, so please go get some food and bring it back here if you've got the time to sustain the conversation. I think there's an awful lot to talk about, and we've certainly learned a lot, and there's a lot for us to think about. So thank you all very much.